All right, here we are for the mind, body, and consciousness chapter, or the mind, body problem chapter. So this is another topic in philosophy that falls under metaphysics, more specifically even than metaphysics, under the metaphysics of the mind or the philosophy of mind. And in this chapter, for the most part, we look at one of the classical problems in the philosophy of mind. It's called the mind-body problem. Right, and so what does that mean, right? So again, philosophy of mind is a branch of metaphysics. Again, metaphysics deals with the nature of existence or reality, and here we're worried about the metaphysics of the human person. We were worried about that issue as well in the last chapter on free will. So there the question was the metaphysical problem of whether human beings have a capacity to direct their own actions or are the author of their own actions, right? And in this chapter, we're worried about, well, are human beings, are they all physical, or do they have a non-physical part as well? And if so, how does that relationship work out? And so the classical problem here is just the mind-body problem, and here's a definition of it: the implicit alleged contradictions that arise as a result of two seemingly different realities involved in attempting to articulate and defend the relationship between the mind, which is traditionally and often understood as a non-physical thing, versus the body, which is obviously a physical thing. So we think of the mind-body problem as starting with a particular question. What's the relationship, the precise relationship between the mind and the body, given that we seem to be at least a pairing of these two disparate realities, these two types of realities? Central to this chapter, and both to the arguments in this chapter and some of the objections to those arguments in this chapter, is Leibniz's law. And so this is the notion that if two separate objects, let me say it that way, are the same sort of thing, then they share all the same essential properties. In other words, the properties that they have to have in order to still be that sort of thing, right? And fail to share no essential properties, also called the indiscernibility of identicals. And so even though you and I have different physical characteristics, I bet everybody's probably willing, at least initially, to say that we're all people. Well, what is it that are the essential characteristics of being a person, right? And that's very close to the mind-body problem, since we think that having personhood, at least in some sense, means having a mind or thoughts, right? Or consciousness. Lots of different ways to get into this material. Let's start with a couple of thought experiments, right? And depending on how you answer these thought experiments, kind of moves you in one direction or another of a certain type of philosophy of mind, a particular theory of mind. So here's one called Kirk and Squire's Zombies. Imagine that an exact physical replica of a given man, something we may conveniently dub a zombie replica, would such an exact physical replica be an exact replica of the man, right? And so this question's driving at a materialist or a physicalist view of the human person. If you say that an exact physical replica of me is identical to me, then what it looks like you're saying is that there's no non-physical part of the person, that the mind is really just a brain that you could have a physical replica of, right? If you said no to that question, then you've got to identify what the replica, what essential property is missing from the replica versus that I have. Here's another one. This time it's about replacements, right? Let's call this Henrietta. Lycan's Henrietta. Lycan is a functionalist philosopher of mind. Later in the chapter, they talk about Andrea and Andrew thought experiments based on two different people, but this one has the same basic idea in it. So imagine that we take a normal human being, an organic human being like you or I, Henrietta, and begin replacing parts of her with synthetic materials, right? And suppose we replace on and on and on until there's nothing left of the original Henrietta, even though she behaves the same way, has the same abilities, even though she's an artifact now or a collection of artifacts. And the question is, did she lose consciousness at some point during the sequence of operations despite her continuing to behave and respond normally? If so, when? And they don't mean lose consciousness like go to sleep or being under the anesthetic that she would have to be under in order to have these operations done. They mean lose the capacity for consciousness. So if we think that the Henrietta, the artifact, is the same as the original Henrietta, then it looks like that means that what it is to have consciousness is really a sign of our behavior. It's our behavior is a signal of that, right? If you think she's different, then you got to pinpoint at what point in the replacement process did she lose the capacity of being a conscious person or not. I'll skip Nagel's bat for now. We'll come back to that in a later lecture. But just a couple of thought experiments there for you to think about briefly to get you thinking about the philosophy of mind. Question, what is a human person, and do we have a non-physical part, or are we all physical? Right? We're going to look at 3 basic philosophies of mind in this chapter, although there are a couple of more discussed. Property dualism is left off the list here. We'll come back and discuss that as well. But we're going to look at 3 main theories for the most part. The first one is substance dualism. The second one is a form of materialism called reductive materialism. Substance dualism says that a human person is a union of 2 different substances, right? Mind and body, a non-physical mind and a physical body. Reductive materialists, they say that we could reduce the mental to the physical, so that we should really think that having a consciousness is identical to having certain neurological states or something like that in the brain. In other words, you can talk about the mind all you want, but what we really mean is the brain, right? A physical thing. And then functionalism, the idea that whether or not a being is conscious or not is best determined by its behavior, and whether it responds appropriately the way a minded or conscious being would respond to certain stimuli or certain inputs from the environment. So those are 3 basic views. And we'll start with substance dualism here. The textbook talks about this movie, Being John Malkovich, which does a really good job of illustrating substance dualism, because in the movie, you go into a porthole and somehow your mind gets taken out of your body, separate 2 substances, right, and put into another body. Right? And so that porthole both raises the question of the mind-body problem as well as illustrates a particular theory of mind, the substance dualist view. And for our substance dualist view, we'll look at a classical position here from René Descartes, who we encountered in previous chapters on epistemology. Well, Descartes was influential for also articulating a substance dualist view of the mind. And so, he offered many arguments for the different arguments for this view, but we're just going to look at one, and it's the divisibility and interactionism argument. So last time we talked about Descartes' idea that I'm a thinking thing, right? And when Descartes, the cogito, when Descartes comes to that conclusion, he doesn't even know if he has a body. So one of the arguments is that, well, he's a thinking thing. He's sure that he's a thinking thing, even if he doesn't have a body. So the body must be separate, right? That's one argument that he gives, a crude version of it, but one version of it. And here we have the divisibility argument. This is the main argument we're going to focus on here. So before, Descartes entertained the dream argument and the evil demon argument to refute them, but here is an argument that he does endorse. So the first observation I make at this point is that there is a great difference between the mind and the body, in so much as the body is by its very nature always divisible, while the mind is utterly indivisible. For when I consider the mind or myself, and so far as I am merely a thinking thing, there's that cogito again, I am unable to distinguish any parts within myself. I understand myself to be something quite single and complete. Although the whole mind seems not to be united to the whole body, I recognize that if a foot or arm or any other part of the body is cut off, nothing is thereby taken away from the mind. Have to worry about the head maybe there. As for the faculties of willing, of understanding, of sensory perception, and so on, these cannot be termed parts of the mind, since it is one and the same that wills and understands and has sensory experiences. There's that unified cogito, unified self, according to Descartes. So by contrast, there's no corporeal or extended thing that I can think of in which, in my thought, I cannot easily divide into parts, and this very fact makes me understand that it is divisible. I can take apart my mouse. I can divide it in half. This one argument would be enough to show me that the mind is completely different than the body. So substance dualism, Descartes' substance dualist, he claims that there are 2 kinds of things that make up reality: thinking stuff, cogito stuff, and extended stuff, bodies, corporeal stuff. And then we're worried about the interaction between those 2 things here. But just using the divisibility argument, we can start to reconstruct Descartes' basic idea here, at least the first part of it. So pause here and try and take Descartes' that paragraph and reconstruct an argument for the conclusion that the mind and body are different substances, or the mind is completely different than the body. right? So pause here and get some help or get some practice doing that using our deductive argument forms, and try to use just one instance of a form there, maybe either modus ponens or modus tollens, provide the premises for the conclusion that the mind is completely different than the body. Right? After you do that, press play again, and I'll show you my reconstruction. All right, so hopefully you've done a little bit of a reconstruction here for this argument. Here's how I did one. So if the mind is indivisible and the body is divisible, then the mind is completely different substance from the body. The mind is indivisible and the body is divisible. We see most of that previous paragraph is arguing for premise 2 there, right? And then the conclusion, thus the mind is completely different substance from the body. This is a modus ponens argument form, so it's valid. The only question is whether it's sound or not. But in this case, we're going to end up with a more complicated argument. We're going to have a two-stage argument here because Descartes wants to argue not only that the mind is different than the body, violating Leibniz's law there, so we should think that there are two different substances. He wants to say that the human person is a union between those two substances. So the mind and body interact with each other somehow. We could talk about different ways of thinking about that interaction. A pilot in the ship model. I'm driving my car gets hurt, and I observe that I have damage, so I'm a thinking thing inside a machine then, right? Maybe I'm a thinking thing inside a body that's just a machine, right? Or 2, which is actually Descartes' view, at least looks like that's his final view, the Cartesian intermingling model, where they're intertwined with one another in some way, right? Here's what Descartes says about that interaction, and which tips his hand in favor of that intermingling model. Cartesian is part of Descartes' name. It refers to his philosophy, right? Cartesianism is the school of thought that Descartes founded. So that means he has particular views about epistemology, mind, nature of reality, and so forth. And so he goes on and he says, nature also teaches me by the sensations of pain and hunger and thirst and so on, that I'm not merely present in my body as a sailor is in the ship, rejecting the pilot and the ship model, but that I'm very closely joined, as it were, intermingled with it, so that I and the body form a unit. If this were not so, I, who am nothing but a thinking thing, would not feel pain when the body was hurt, but would perceive the damage purely by intellect, just as a sailor perceives by sight if anything is broken on his ship. Right? And so we have the divisibility argument here, and I'm going to extend that a little bit, drawing on that passage that we just looked at about interactionism. So we've got the idea, the substance dualist conclusion, but we want to get to the conclusion that the mind and body two different substances form a unit, right? And so I can add a line 4 here. If the body is completely different substance than the mind, then the mind interacts with the body and the pineal gland to form a unit in the body. Descartes argued, I didn't provide a quote from this, but Descartes argued in the Passions of the Soul and the Treatise on the Nature of Man, that the pineal gland, this part in the brain, which has a long history of being thought about in terms of this sort of thing, leading up to Descartes' own time, was the seat or the location where the mind acted on the body, the brain in that case, right? And then we can make a little modus ponens argument out of lines 3 and 4 to get us to, thus the mind interacts with the body and the pineal gland to form a mind-body unit. And so here we have the completed argument, the divisibility, interactionism argument for substance dualism, right? And so, let me back up there. So the idea here is that the first stage of the argument, Descartes uses Leibniz's law to show that because the body has the essential property of being divisible, but the mind lacks that property, that essential property of divisibility, they must be different substances, but also that they are intermingled with one another and form a unit. So the human person is a unit of a non-physical mind and a physical body, and the location at where those two things interact, according to Descartes, is that pineal gland. Right? So that's a basic argument for substance dualism, right? Again, now would be a good time to pause and kind of review both the reading from the text as well as the stuff in the lecture notes in this lecture before moving on to the criticisms, right? So again, a good point to pause here and review. After you've done that, come back and we'll take a look at the criticisms. And there are several criticisms of substance dualism which take issue with different parts of the argument. And so again, for our purposes, those short answer assignments we're working on, you need to pick out which premise or premises each particular conclusion is targeting or challenging, right? Those were two valid argument forms. The only question is whether they're going to be sound or not, whether the premises are all true. And if those premises are true, do they really prove the conclusion? So some arguments against the divisibility part of the argument, the first stage of the argument. We've got three basic ones. One comes from contemporary psychology and is based on the idea of dissociative identity disorder, or what is more popularly talked about in terms of multiple personalities. Contemporary neurobiology, severing the corpus callosum, the two hemispheres of the brain. When that happens to people, either by accident or because they're trying to fix epileptic problems or something like that, the people who had that procedure done report of being of two minds sometimes, right? So that challenges the distinctness of the mind from the body. And then there's more of a logical objection here that's based on a fallacy, a new fallacy that we haven't covered yet, called begging the question, or for our purposes, we can also think of it in terms of circular reasoning. And that fallacy occurs when the premises of the argument presuppose the truth of the conclusion, right? Implicitly, of course, is usually how that works. So if you can show that Descartes is kind of assuming that the mind is indivisible because he's already presupposing it's a non-physical thing, that would be a problem for the argument, right? And so contemporary psychology, how that dissociative identity disorder challenges Descartes is it shows that maybe the mind isn't indivisible, right? That if we have different personalities and some of the personalities are aware of the other main personality or the other sub-personalities, but not vice versa, that would seem to imply that the mind is a divisible thing, right? Rather than an indivisible thing. And then we have some criticisms of the, well, before we get to that, go back here and look at the basic argument. So for each of those objections, the corpus callosum objection, the dissociative identity disorder objection, and the begging the question objection, and I've already tipped off that they're aiming at the divisibility part of the argument, so that's lines 1 through 3. Which premises in this argument do they challenge, and what kind of objection are they? Are they errors of fact, fallacy, self-contradiction, a false conditional, or maybe one of our informal fallacies? And again, we've just added one, begging the question, to that initial list that we've already had. So sit and think about which of those objections challenges which of those lines, 1 and 2, or one, or it could be both, or it could be one or the other, depending on the objection. Right? You need to try to pin down each the premises for each one of those objections. All right, and then we have some criticisms of the interactionism part of the argument. So that's the last couple of lines there, really 3 through 5. But of course, we're not worried about the conclusion. We're worried about the premises. And of course, 3, although it's a sub-conclusion, it functions like a new premise for the second part of the argument. And here we get 3 objections as well, all that are kind of rooted in scientific information, right? And so we have the location objection, the force objection, and the conservation of energy objection. So these are all objections rooted in science in some way. Right? Let's focus on a couple of these for the sake of time. Let's think about the location objection. So if you think about positing a seat or a location of where the mind interacts in the body, it looks like for a thing to have a location, it has to be a physical thing. So that starts to generate a problem there, right? Let's take a look at a passage from a contemporary philosopher who argues along those lines. So he says, interactionism becomes quite unintelligible. What he means by that is logically unintelligible or incoherent or contradictory, maybe, right? Need to worry about that. As soon as one endeavors to spell out in some detail, some considerable detail, how some bodily change, right? And then show how a mental or non-physical process can in any way be involved in that physical change, that bodily change. It's not enough to say that the mind acts upon the body at some particular mental thing like an idea or a thought, acts upon some particular part of the body in the brain, right? It is the precise localization of such activity that presents great difficulty, as of course it must, since mental states are, by the very description of them usually given to them, not localizable. What he means by the description usually given to them is that they're non-physical things. So if you're a non-physical thing, you can't have a location. So to say at any point in the description that the mind acts upon the body is not to really explain anything. And remember, we're trying to explain the precise nature of the relationship between mind and body, if there really is a non-physical mind. And so he continues here, but it's just to spare oneself the task of pursuing the description of physical, right, processes any further. So what he's claiming here is that it can't be the case that the mind is both non-physical and non-localizable, but that we say the mind acts on the body and then give it a location, right? That ought to tip you off as to what kind of objection the location objection really is there. And then here's another objection from Hasker, again, challenging the interactionism part of the objection. He says, on the dualistic view, why should consciousness itself be interrupted by drugs or a blow to the head or the need for sleep? Why should reasoning, generally thought of as a distinctive activity of the conscious mind, be interrupted by such physical disturbances? When you ingest a drug like alcohol or some other drug, it messes with your mental states. Well, mental states are usually given the description of non-physical, right? The natural conclusion from Cartesian dualism or substance dualism would seem to be that consciousness should continue unabated during such times, deprived to be sure of sensory input and the capacity for motor action. So in other words, if the mind is really a separate substance from the body and is non-physical, how is it that physical things like drugs or alcohol or a blow to the head would mess with my consciousness in any way? The idea here is that, well, really, it must be something physical, right? So these objections are pushing us in the direction of a different philosophy of mind then. Not a lot of substance dualists running around philosophy at this point, but we might wonder whether they really have a good reason or not, right? And given the force of kind of the cumulative force of those objections, it kind of pushes us in the direction of the idea that, look, we're not really spelling out the precise nature of a relationship between a non-physical mind and a physical body. What we really ought to do is think about rejecting the idea that the mind is non-physical and think about that in terms of just the physical thing, the brain, right? And so the objections to substance dualism seem to push us in the direction of another philosophy of mind, and we'll cover that next time with reductive materialism. In the meantime, if you have any questions about what we covered here or anything in the reading, be sure and hit me up and we'll talk about it. Hope y'all are all doing well.